Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
Custard creams could get us through this, you know.
Well, if you put some custard creams and a couple of cans of Carling in, I might apply for one.
Hello, I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and welcome to Chopper's Politics. I'm back in my sitting room this week, armed with a microphone, a laptop, some headphones, and through the wonders of technology, some amazing guests. My breakfasts aren't yet on a par with my usual haunt, the Red Lion pub, but they're getting better the longer the lockdown continues. Now, before we start, a huge thanks to those of you who've been tweeting our Choppers podcast account and leaving comments on our Apple podcast page. That's Holly5, Tony Bob, Captain Cuttle, to name just a few. We're really pleased that you're pleased that we're carrying on, even if we're not quite as crisp as you might be used to. Please keep the comments coming. We really need them. They help maintain morale for me and Louisa, the producer. Now this week, Robert Jenrick, the Community Secretary, has been giving out isolation hampers to millions of homes. A number of police forces this week have been accused of being overzealous in their enforcement of the coronavirus lockdown rules. But one MP who knows a lot about people travelling to an area and to walk there and risk breaking these lockdown rules is Clwyd West MP and former Brexit Minister David Jones. And the PM's friend, the biographer Andrew Gimson, will be on, telling us how he thinks the PM has coped with running the country from isolation. And we'll be talking all things Labour leadership race. Yes, remember that? Still going on. With former Labour member, podcaster and comedian Matt Forde. Now my first guest is a former government advisor and controversial commentator, Toby Young. This week, Toby caused a stir on social media by saying that spending £350 billion to prolong the lives of a few 100,000 mostly elderly people is an irresponsible use of taxpayers' money. Toby, how do you justify those comments?
Well, many people on Twitter and elsewhere reacted with outrage because my argument involved putting a monetary value on human life. And some people seemed to think that was a uniquely kind of twisted Tory neoliberal perspective. But in fact, all governments put a cash value on extending people's lives, Labour governments as well as Conservative governments. And if you're at all familiar with health economics, you know that there has to be an upper limit on what taxpayers can reasonably be expected to pay to keep people alive. And that's particularly true when dealing with the NHS, which is a centralised, free at the point of use system, which can only function on the basis of rationing, since demand for healthcare is essentially limitless if it's free. And the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, NICE, places an upper valuation limit of £30,000 for each quality adjusted life year. So essentially, for each year that a medical intervention or a new medical device extends a person's life, NICE puts an upper limit of about £30,000. So when deciding what new drugs, what new equipment in the NHS to fund, NICE puts an upper value of about £30,000 on each additional year of perfect health that intervention will add to someone's life. And so if you use that metric, you can begin to assess whether the cost of locking down the economy is justified in terms of the lives it's likely to save. And it's quite a complicated calculation for a variety of reasons. But my back of the envelope calculation is that the average age of a COVID-19 fatality is 79 and a half. Average life expectancy in the UK is about 81. We know from the data in Wuhan that about 67% of COVID-19 fatalities have significant comorbidities and therefore have a shorter life expectancy on average than 9 years. And there is some data showing that elderly persons with comorbidities should have their life expectancy adjusted downward by about 3 years. So I think we can assume that each of those people who would otherwise die if we weren't imposing a lockdown probably have about 6 years to live. According to Dr. Neil Ferguson, by switching from a strategy of mitigation to suppression, we are saving the lives of approximately 230,000 people. If you multiply 230,000 by 6, that gives you 1,380,000 QALYs. And if we assign the upper limit of £30,000 per QALY, that means that the total value of those lives we're saving is about 41.4 billion. And that's lower, I think, than even the most optimistic assessments of the economic cost of the lockdown. So there is a kind of cold-hearted economic cost-benefit analysis you can do, which I did in The Critic and which understandably outraged a lot of people, showing that actually, even if we accept Professor Ferguson's projection that we are effectively saving 230,000 lives by engaging in these extreme social distancing measures, the economic cost of those lives is greater than what we would normally value them at in ordinary times. You know, I think Rishi Sunak used the phrase "whatever it takes," which suggests that the normal way in which we assess just how much value for money we're getting from each taxpayer pound spent has been jettisoned. Other politicians around the world have also said that it would be inhumane in the current circumstances to try and place, say, monetary value on human life. And it may be that there is some public support for that position, but it's unclear to me that that support will last indefinitely.
Do you have any relations over 79 and a half years old?
I don't. I do have a mother-in-law in her 70s, and I know plenty of other elderly people. So I can certainly see the argument for spending more than we would in normal times to try and extend their lives. But I do think at some point, perhaps I went a little early, but at some point I do think we have to have a public debate about the economic cost of the lockdown and whether it's worth it. I mean, another consideration, Chris, is that there's an economist at Bristol University, and this work too has been quite controversial. He's called Philip Thomas. He's a professor of risk management. And he's calculated that if GDP contracts by more than 6.4% over the next 2 years as a result of the lockdown, then more years of life will be lost than saved. And he calculates that by looking at the impact on mortality of things like rising poverty, rising violent crime, rising suicide. Now, this is controversial. Some economists dispute that economic downturns actually have an impact on mortality. So that's another thing we have to bear in mind, I think.
But you understand the difficulties of politicians saying to anybody that economically your life isn't worth saving. I know that's what, when NICE have to choose whether to fund medicines on the NHS, they are saying we can't afford this. I'm very sorry to families worried about their loved ones. But for politicians, you can see how hard it is to make these points, can't you?
Yes, of course. And you can understand why, for the government, preventing the NHS being overwhelmed is an absolute priority. They want to avoid nightly television news pictures like those we've been seeing from Italy. But as you probably noticed, last week, the University of Oxford produced some modelling which showed that it could be that as many as 50% of the UK population have been infected. And if that's the case, then we're well on our way to acquiring herd immunity. And the demand for critical hospital care, if we relax the social distancing measures, won't be as great as the March 16th Imperial College paper anticipated. This week, we've seen the opening of the Nightingale Hospital, which has the capacity to treat 4,000 patients. I mean, I think everyone's been impressed by the response of the NHS to this crisis, but I think that the NHS's ability to create additional capacity has been a pleasant surprise. And it may be that if we relax the social distancing measures now, the demand wouldn't be so great that the NHS would be overwhelmed. Admittedly, that would be a big political risk to take.
You finished the article with an extraordinary line there, which I'll read out for the listener. You said that my death would be acceptable collateral damage. You're 56 years old with no underlying health conditions. That's quite a comment to make, isn't it? I mean, it shows where we are, I suppose, in politics now.
Yes, I mean, I did say that some people reading the article might think I'd change my tune if I got the virus and suddenly my own life was in jeopardy if we relaxed the social distancing measures and I couldn't get a place in an ICU ward. But I said that if that was the case, that would be a personal tragedy. But extending the lives of the minority of patients who don't have comorbidities and aren't in their 60s or 70s would be acceptable, would probably be, again, too high a price to pay for the overall impact on our economy, which, after all, will probably lead to a greater loss of life in the long run. I mean, one of the ways in which politicians are being slightly dishonest, I think, is when they talk about things like whatever it takes and not being prepared to put a value on human life, is if you accept Professor Philip Thomas's modelling, which shows that actually the impact just in terms of loss of life, if we maintain the lockdown for another 18 months, will be greater than the number of lives saved, then the politicians aren't making the morally courageous decision to spend all this taxpayers' money to preserve human life. What they're effectively doing is prioritising visible life now over invisible lives lost in the future. And that smacks of just normal short-termism.
Toby Young, thank you so much for joining us on this week's Choppers Politics. That article in The Critic is online and we'll post a link to it in the show notes for this episode. Toby, thank you so much.
Thanks, Chris.
Now, this week has been dominated on the radio phone-ins and in people's homes about what you can do in this period of social isolation. Are you allowed to go out and do the shopping, go to work? Can you walk the dog? Where can you walk the dog? These questions have been dominating the debate nationally. And one MP who's heard a lot about that debate locally is Clwyd Western Tory MP David Jones, whose constituency is a magnet for tourism. David Jones, welcome back to Choppers Politics. How are you in North Wales?
Fine, thank you. Self-isolating, but nevertheless, I've got a lovely view and the weather is not too bad up here.
Are you ill then, or are you just isolating because of the need to distance?
No, that's what we're doing. We're keeping well away from people keeping well away from us, which is what they tend to do with MPs anyway.
It's quite odd, isn't it? I mean, how are you finding it? You're quite a tourist destination, aren't you, in North Wales?
Yes, that's right. My constituency is right on the A55, which is the main tourist route into North Wales. And the road normally at this time of year starts to get very crowded, but at the moment it's almost completely dead. There was a bit of a worry a couple of weeks ago when just after the lockdown was announced, people seemed to regard it as a signal to have an early public holiday. But that's stopped now and things are a lot better.
Have you been daubing messages on cars with funny number plates, David?
No, I don't do that sort of thing. There was a sign on the Menai Bridge a couple of years ago on a bank holiday which said, "Sorry, turn around, Anglesy's full," but I don't think that's been repeated this time.
No, quite. But did you think it's been overblown, this, or do you have any sympathy for people who want to drive half an hour to get a walk on the beach or on the Great Orme, for example? Do you not feel as though maybe, come on, aren't we being a bit tough on people wanting to have a break and walk on their own in the countryside?
Well, you've got to remember that tourism is the bread and butter of this area, and normally we're delighted to see people coming in. But the fact is that at the moment, people really should not be coming into North Wales or really driving very far from their own home, because, of course, it runs the risk of spreading the virus. And I think just at this moment, the message that we want to give to people is, look, when this is all over, we'll be delighted to see you, but just for the moment, please stay at home.
Are the rules a bit mad at the moment? I think on fishing, for example, you can go fishing in the sea, but you can't go fishing on a river, even though you might be on your own in both instances.
Yeah, and I think that that's a general problem because, of course, all this has been developed quite quickly. We've got the new Coronavirus Act in place, but I had a conference this morning with the Chief Constable of North Wales, Carl Fawkes, and he was making the point that really a lot of the regulations are pretty grey, and he and his officers are having to sort of feel their way along in enforcing them.
Is there anything that he'd like to change in those rules?
Not really, no. I think he recognises that the police are going through a learning curve, but by and large, the impression I get from my constituents, at least, is that people think the police are doing a good job. And despite the headlines we've been seeing over the last few days, I don't think they're being heavy-handed. I think they're trying to exercise a degree of common sense. Most people, I think, recognise that the regulations are there to protect them and to protect their families, and they regard them as common sense. You will get people who will always try to push the envelope, and I think that from my conversation with the Chief Constable this morning, the police are trying to be sensible in responding to that and not be too heavy-handed.
You're a former government minister in the Brexit department. How can ministers maintain support for the lockdown as it goes on? And we're only in week 2 at the moment, aren't we?
Yeah, I think that the important thing for ministers to do is to be transparent, or as transparent as possible, with the public. People, I think, respond well to being treated as adults, and provided they know that the measures that have been put in place are starting to work and that they're for the general benefit of the population, will continue to respect them. I think that the danger point will be if people start to think that they're not being kept informed of progress over the response to the coronavirus.
But it's been good news for the goats of Great Orme, I see.
Yeah, it is. The Llandudno goats have become really viral, and they really have got a great history. The Llandudno goats were a present by the Shah of Persia to Queen Victoria, and they're a tremendously important part of the local scene. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers goat comes from the Great Orme, and he's a serving soldier. He's got the rank of Lance Corporal, and he's always called Billy. So they're quite important. I remember Michael Portillo came to Llandudno a few years ago, and we spotted some of the goats eating somebody's hedge. So I told Michael Portillo that the goats had been a present from the Shah of Persia to Queen Victoria, and he said, "Oh, really?" He said, "They must be terribly old."
Those goats, though, they've been eating your hedge, haven't they?
They have. I've got an office in Llandudno, and they've invaded our front lawn, and they had to go to our hedge. And it's really a bit rich that when you really have to rely upon goats to trim your hedge at a time of lockdown.
Yes, it's a different time at the moment. Just look at Brexit, David Jones. You've got a senior role in the European Research Group of Tory MPs. That group, of course, which dominated politics last year while the Brexit debate was being played out. Where do you sit on the issue of the transition period being extended from the end of this year?
Well, I think we have to wait and see. At the moment, I don't think there is any reason to do so. The negotiations did stall briefly, but they've started again, I think, using video conferencing. So they can continue. The important thing to remember is that both sides now are agreed as to what the objective is, and that's a free trade agreement. And if you've got that clear objective, then you should be able to work your way around it. I don't think that really people would relish the prospect of an extension of the transition period, particularly at a time when Europe itself seems to be falling to pieces. And there's clearly a significant amount of division between, for example, the southern countries like Italy and northern countries such as Germany. So Europe itself is not particularly united. And therefore, I think that really we need to get out of it as soon as we can.
It might be easier for the UK because, of course, there's a financial side to it, if we say, in the EU in terms of the transition period going up after January, which falls into, do we start bailing out other countries for their difficulties through this dreadful crisis? I mean, it's a big issue. It's not an easy thing to do, is it, to extend?
Well, it's not easy, but of course we will need as much money as we can to remain in this country. And you're quite right. If we have to continue supporting other countries after the end of the anticipated transition period, I think there'd be a lot of resistance domestically. People, I think, want us to leave. As I say, we've got an agreed objective of a free trade agreement, and that's what we should be working towards at pace.
Do you think in any sense that this dreadful crisis with coronavirus really puts the Brexit debate into a degree of context from last year?
It does, because I think that despite all the divisions that we saw in the country last year, one thing is very clear, that the country is now very united. and if it's possible to say that the coronavirus has had any beneficial effect, and that's really stretching it, it is that the country is united, and the controversy over Brexit has really fallen back into the past.
Well, David Jones there, a member of the Public Administration Committee and a Brexiteer and a former member of the government as a minister. Thank you so much for joining us from North Wales on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Many thanks, Chris.
Right, stay with me. In just a moment, I'll be talking to the Boriss Boswell, Andrew Gimson, right after this.
Go beyond the headlines with the Telegraph's daily coronavirus podcast, a roundup of the latest news on the pandemic from our leading journalists, with analysis on the impact on health, business and travel every weekday evening. Search Coronavirus the Latest on your podcast app.
Right, we're back at Choppers Towers and this is Choppers Politics. Now, in proof that the virus doesn't discriminate, Boris Johnson will on Friday emerge from his quarantine period after confirming he tested positive for COVID-19 last week. But was he pacing number 10 in his pyjamas? Is he more of a cool, calm, collected, self-isolation customer? One man who knows him better than most is his biographer and lifelong friend, Andrew Gimson. And he joins me now via the wonders of technology. Andrew Gimson, welcome to Choppers Politics. We're doing this remotely. I last saw you in the pub before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. We had a chat about how it would turn out for him. Now, you're known as Boris Boswell, aren't you? Because, of course, you wrote the book on Boris Johnson all those years ago.
I did indeed write The Life of Johnson. It was one of the most enjoyable things I've ever done because people, whether they love or hate him, they love talking about him.
I think I've got a first edition, and I'm sure it's called The Rise and Fall of Boris Johnson, which you then amended to The Rise and Rise of Boris Johnson.
It's now called Boris, The Making of the Prime Minister. That's the latest title.
How do you think he's coped with a week in solitary?
He in some ways, he is a solitary person. He likes being able to please himself, to sort of read what he likes, wear what he likes. On the other hand, he really needs to talk to people as well. And so not being cut off, that would have been absolutely vital, that he can ring anyone who he suddenly feels he needs to talk to.
He looked a bit rough, I thought, in his video on Twitter that went out on Wednesday night when he talked about testing. Did you see it?
I did see it, and I agree, he did look a little bit rough, but very, very concerned to show that he was still sort of energetic and in charge, and that Dominic Raab doesn't need to take over. I thought that was very characteristic of Boris. There was some occasion when everyone was trying to become editor of The Spectator, and he invited the 4 front runners to a lunch all together, all these 4 very ambitious journalists, just to sort of show he knew what they were up to, and they were all trying to get this job, which he himself had. And he's now in this position as Prime Minister. Of course, everyone round him thinks of themselves as the next Prime Minister, and he's jolly determined that none of them emerges as the sort of heir apparent. So he chose Dominic Raab, who's possibly the least convincing of the senior ministers in that role, in theory, to stand in for him. But in practice, of course, very anxious to be known to be keeping going himself.
And of course, Andrew Gimson, Boris Johnson's poll ratings are riding high. And do you think that people are trusting him through this? Because he's going against his better instincts, closing down much of British life, shutting pubs, nationalising the railways, doing all sorts of major state interventions and activity. People kind of trust him because it's against his nature. Were it to be maybe a left-wing government in power, there may be a concern that it was part of a plan to keep us this way for many years to come. But with the current PM, people trust him. It's an emergency measure in a short-term way rather than long-term. Is that right, do you think?
I think that's right. I think they can see he's not a sort of bossy person. He's not one of nature's sort of prefects who wants to be enforcing a lot of petty rules just for the sheer pleasure of exercising power over us. But the other very important thing is that he's not trying to do it all himself. And the financial side of it has been done by Rishi Sunak, who he appointed Chancellor, and who obviously has an amazing command of the detail and also communicates in a very calm way what he's doing. And I think that also has been a very important part of reassuring the public that the government does have a grip. If you had a Chancellor at the moment who didn't understand and didn't have that tone of voice, I think people would be much more frightened about the economic consequences of this pandemic. So, and that is, I mean, Johnson deserves some of the credit for that because he appointed the present Chancellor.
That's right, but we'll be seeing a lot more of the PM this weekend, I imagine, don't you think?
I think he knows that he's got to be visible. Sometimes it will just be him, but often it will be him with, say, a couple of the chief scientist and the chief doctor or whatever it may be, or with Rishi Sunak or with other senior ministers. So that will sort of demonstrate, it doesn't really need to be said, but people know that you have to have teamwork to sort out the very difficult logistical and other problems which we still face.
Andrew Gimson, author of Boris Johnson, A Life, or The Rise and Fall of Boris Johnson, or whatever it's called nowadays. Thank you so much for coming on Choppers Politics. It's been great to have you on, and do come on again. Thank you.
Love to, thank you.
Now this weekend, finally, is the end of the Labour leadership contest, and someone new will take the reins to replace Jeremy Corbyn as leader. Sir Keir Starmer is the far and away favourite over Lisa Nandy and Rebecca Long-Bailey. But what a time to take the role. And here to discuss how Labour's next leader can win the 2024 general election and surviving lockdown is comedian and former Labour Party member Matt Forde. Matt, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Hello, I'm very good, thanks. How are you?
Very good. Well, when you last came on this, it was called Chopper's Brexit podcast, and now, because Brexit's been sorted out, it's now called Choppers Politics. But it seems like this is a much worse situation than we could even imagine at the worst point of Brexit, don't you think?
Definitely, but I think there's a strange positive in that. I think for all of us who, and I became very animated about Brexit on the Remain side, and it's not my cup of tea, but I accept the result, and I accept the result of the election. Compared to Brexit, this crisis is just so much bigger, and I think after this. Not that Brexit won't continue to be an issue and the issues around it won't have a political and economic impact, but I just think once the country's been through this, Brexit, I think, feels very small, and I think that can only be seen as a positive thing.
Some argued it was a row about trading rules, but not much else. But this is life and death situation. Now, how are you doing? Because I know you're in lockdown, aren't you?
I am. I can't leave the flat for 12 weeks. I can't physically leave, which I've slowly coming to terms with. But I think most people like to leave the house at least once a day. But it's because of my asthma. I don't have any symptoms at the moment, so I'm healthy and well, just to reassure people. But I have quite severe asthma, so following the advice from the government, I'm not allowed out until mid-June.
Goodness me, you're being shielded, and that means you're entitled to a Robert Jenrick food parcel. Have you applied for one yet?
Oh, I didn't realise that.
Yes.
I
yes.
think it would be cheeky of me to apply for that. Depends what's in it.
Well, as if your partner can get out, then perhaps you're not allowed to get one. But he did add in custard creams for millions of people last week. When you listen back to last week's podcast, you'll hear him confess to that. He loves biscuits. He likes to raid the cupboards at night, he tells me. So I think he's doing his best. I think custard creams could get us through this.
Well, if he puts some custard creams and a couple of cans of Carling in, I might apply for one. But I don't feel that I think it would be wrong of me to have it. But because I can't leave the house, I've got to exercise somehow. So I've been doing these Joe Wicks workouts, and oh my God, I'm in physical pain.
I know,
I feel like I've been hit by a train. So I've ordered an exercise bike because I'm too wet for Joe Wicks. Yeah, I mean I track my steps on a on the app on the phone, and I try and do 10,000 steps a day, and was walking a lot and was running a lot. I checked it the other day. I'd done 100 steps all day. Now, if that carries on till mid-June, I'm going to be a fat pie. So I need to make sure I'm moving. Yeah. So I think an exercise bike or home workouts are the key.
Yeah. Well, my time in isolation appears to have dovetailed with our dog deciding that she wants to pee in our sitting room every single day. So this room smells like some kind of sort of wet weed-on blanket, but I can't escape it. But are we going to have a massive all-nighter? A street party or something big when this is all over? I mean, what a party.
Oh, yes, of course.
Now, listen, in terms of, I mentioned the word party, and I'll use that to jump into the Labour Party. Now, you resigned as a party member on the day that Jeremy Corbyn became elected Labour leader in 2015. He stands down finally after 5 years on Saturday. Let's start with the lessons the party can learn from that period. What are the lessons that the party needs to take on from that, do you think?
There are so many. I mean, fundamentally, the number one lesson, which even at my age of 37, I felt like I'd learned by the age of 15, was that Labour cannot win a general election from a hard left position. And sadly, we've had to demonstrate that twice now in the last 2 or 3 years in order for people to get the message. And I'm not entirely sure that they have got the message, which I think brings me on to the second lesson, which is never presume that people draw the same conclusions that you do from clear defeat. Never presume the argument is always necessarily won or lost, despite the evidence that apparently faces you, because other people will draw different conclusions and will contort themselves in order to find excuses. People don't like admitting they're wrong. Fundamentally, on top of those things, you have to pick a leader that is competent, that is sensible, that is charismatic, that is intelligent, and Jeremy Corbyn was none of those things. I mean, it was just a catastrophic failure on every level. And
yet supporters would say the opposite. They would say he is charismatic, he has got ideas, it's a media conspiracy to say what you're saying about him, wouldn't they?
They do. I mean, some of his more candid supporters say, oh, well, what they tried to do for a while was spin his lack of charisma as a virtue in itself. They'd say, oh, well, he's not charismatic and that's what's attractive.
Like with Theresa May, of course, post-Cameron. It's the same argument, wasn't it?
Yes, and I suppose to some extent with Gordon Brown after Tony Blair, but what Gordon Brown and Theresa May both had, they were politicians of some stature, as well, was that they had a reputation either from running the Treasury or the Home Office that had got them to that office. Whereas Jeremy Corbyn had never run a department and never will, and obviously should never have been allowed to, which is why he wasn't. On top of that, Labour's anti-Semitism crisis needs to be immediately addressed and dealt with, and the attacks on the Equalities and Human Rights Commission need to be not just stopped but apologised for. And it's not just words. People need to be expelled, and I think whoever the new leader is, it looks like it's going to be Keir Starmer, unless they have a kind of Neil Kinnock militant moment where they visibly drive these people and these tendencies out of the party, I don't think they can ever win an election.
If Keir Starmer wins, I mean, he's got to find a way to accommodate the left, hasn't he? Or else the party conferences will become a massive battle with everyone watching what Len McCluskey's saying on the sidelines and how that conflicts with Labour Party policy.
Yeah, but I just think they're going to do that anyway. You're dealing with people who enjoy showing off, who enjoy flexing their muscles, who enjoy... I mean, in the short term, maybe... if he wins by a big margin and that brings people on side and he makes assurances behind the scenes, fine. But as the years tick by, Len McCluskey and people like that want the Corbyn agenda to remain, and any attack or any attempt to move a millimetre to the right of the Corbyn project will trigger, endless rumours about a civil war and humiliation at conference. I mean, even at the peak of Tony Blair's powers, party conference was always tricky, was always risky. These people are more emboldened now than they were then. The thing is, as well, is it's not that there isn't a kind of more left-wing Labour that can't be accommodated within a centre-left Labour Party, because we saw that in the Blair years, and some of those voices are important and competent, and they're not agitators and they're not anti-Semites, but the ones that are need to be expelled. And the lesson for the future, I think, is Jeremy Corbyn was allowed to vote against a Labour government 500 times in Parliament and face no sanction. And if Labour ever comes to its senses again and can get itself to a point where it can win elections, you have to be ruthless with people like that, because if not, you are sowing the seeds of your own destruction in the long term.
Well, you mentioned there win elections. Now, what do you think about 2024? I'm coming around to the view that Labour with the right leader who is attractive to Middle England has got a bit of a chance, because I think the fallout from this crisis could be very difficult for the Tories to bear. They could be focused on austerity, on not investing in NHS, policing, not preparing for a pandemic, which could mean that by 2024, in the same way Churchill lost the 45 election, you could have Labour, overturning this 80-seat majority under the right leader.
Maybe, but I mean, who knows who the Prime Minister will be then, let alone the Labour leader. If it's Prime Minister Sunak, then things might be very different. I don't think you can underestimate, the impact of that Rishi Sunak statement the other week. I just think that has the potential to absolutely transform the way we think about the Tory party. I mean, it's arguably the most centre-ground thing it's the most nationally responsible piece of economic policy since the independence of the Bank of England. And it's more profound than that for people's lives. Because even for a lot of friends of mine who are Tories, they would accept that sometimes they don't come across as the most compassionate party. The fear that people have when the Tories win sometimes is that will they really look after those most in need? And this package, that announcement says to the nation, the Tory party, and obviously, let's see, because some people need more the help than others, and will they get the help they need and all the rest of it. But just as a big announcement, I think that would have been so emotional for the country to hear, and I think that will have a real impact in people's relationship with the Tory party. Now, that doesn't mean they can't throw that away, and they might do, but I just think on top of that, Labour winning back places like Sedgefield and Ashfield and Mansfield, Bolsover. Yeah, this is, maybe Middle England might come around to Keir Starmer, but places like that. And I think Labour might be able to win back the swing seats, the places we always talk about like Nuneaton and whatever under Keir Starmer, but can they win back those places as well? And that's now the challenge.
Final question for you, Matt Forde. Nottingham Forest are 5th in the EFL Championship standings. Is there more likelihood of Labour winning the 2024 election or the Forest getting back to the Premier League?
Forest getting back to the Premier League. And I think that's something the country would rather see as well.
Brian Clough will be proud of you. Thank you so much, Matt Forde, for phoning in from isolation. Thank you for coming on Chopper's Politics. I really appreciate it.
Cheers, Chopper. See you soon.
And huge thanks to my guests this week, David Jones MP, Andrew Gimson, Toby Young, and of course, Matt Forde. And don't forget, we will put a link to Toby Young's article in the show notes to this episode. Thank you to my producers, Elliot Lampitt, Louisa Wells, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for taking the time to listen. If you've enjoyed the episode, please do us a huge favour and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Or tell your friends about the show, mention it on your weekly daily Zoom call, scream about it to your virtual pub quiz team. And don't forget, you can stay up to date with all the Telegraph's brilliant news and analysis and politics, including the work of our unparalleled global health security team for free for the first 30 days by going to telegraph.co.uk/chopper. And if there's something you want us to talk about in this podcast, please do email us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, and follow us on Twitter. If you don't already, of course, we are @Choppers Podcast. Until next time, cheerio!